Hello and welcome along to Edie Extra, the podcast channel for discussions about sustainability leadership with sustainability leaders. And for today's episode, it's great to be chatting about the opportunity of the UK's transition to net zero and what that will look like in each of our major regions. I'll be talking about this with Mark Burton, who is the head of regions at Lloyds Corporate and Institutional, after we've been working together on a 12-month programme on the regional net zero transition, which we can dive into and which has been a pleasure to be a part of. So, Mark, thank you very much for your time. How are you doing?
I'm really good, Sarah, thank you, and delighted to be joining you today. So looking forward to the conversation.
Of course, and it's great to catch up, Mark. For the benefit of the listeners, it'd be great to get an introduction to yourself and how your role is involved in net zero at Lloyds.
I run the UK regions for our corporate institutional bank, but I also wear a couple of other hats as well. One that's relevant to this conversation is I'm one of 10 group ambassadors that Lloyds Bank has appointed across the UK to really reflect the importance that we place on place and regions. So I'm the group ambassador for Yorkshire and Humber, and very much that role is about how can we use the convening power of Lloyds Banking Group to make sure we're supporting as many aspects as we can possibly do so within a particular region, whether that's financial inclusion, energy transition, housing, or any other key topics that we can support on. So a couple of hats, and by way of background, I hail from the northeast, live in Yorkshire, so have a very particular regional bias as well, I'm afraid to say. And in terms of involvement on net zero, I guess it crosses a number of different points. I can go back to actually 2021, and I can remember being sat in my house in York on Teams screens as we were going through the COVID period with a number of different city leaders from around the UK who were reflecting on the fact that actually they knew things had changed. They knew their city regions had changed. They knew how their populations were going to behave and interact with local infrastructure and what have you was going to change as well. And what they just didn't know was how do they react to it. So that was sort of the genesis of our regional development team that we've now got in place, which was looking at how can we support our regions around the UK to regenerate, and obviously with that unlock jobs, unlock growth in a post-COVID environment, and equally support that net zero transition, because as we know around the UK, we heard it at the dinners and the roundtables, there are a number of varying commitments around transition to net zero targets in different corners of the UK. So one of my areas, therefore, is that regional development team, and within that, we've set up a regional regeneration fund of about £1 billion to unlock jobs, growth, and net zero transition. I've been heavily involved with the National Wealth Fund in terms of, as have Lloyds, around looking at how can we work in partnership with them to develop sort of blended finance solution where we work alongside them to come together to produce loans to help social housing providers retrofit some of their housing stock. So we've committed £500 million to that. From a Lloyds Banking Group perspective, we're also, something I'm particularly pleased with is we're looking at backing, well, we're already backing over 800 businesses and 10,500 jobs with £43 million of community development finance. And for those that don't know what that's about really finance being deployed in local areas for local businesses by people who understand their local geography. So I think that's a really great way of unlocking some of the potential of some of those more localized areas within particular regions. And then on a macro scale, we're supporting large corporates and institutions in our own world with 30 billion of sustainable finance. And another thing I think that's quite important, and something we'll probably talk on later, is empowering local SMEs and educators with about £19 million in apprenticeship funding as well. And I think we'll come on to that later, but the skills agenda is something that came out quite loud and clear through the roundtable conversations as well. So plenty going on and plenty more for us to do.
Great. So much interesting work already going on with financing. And you've mentioned there some roundtables, etc. So just for the benefit of the listeners, so for the last 12 months, Edie and the Lloyds team have been working together on a net zero regions programme. We've hosted 4 regional roundtables in Edinburgh, Manchester, Bristol and Birmingham, convening businesses and other key local stakeholders to do a sort of temperature check on the net zero transition across the UK and how that's taking shape, the key opportunities, the key learnings and the remaining roadblocks. So we've been doing a lot of gathering, a lot of qualitative and quantitative research. So it's been a bit of an eye-opener for us here at Edie, and Mark's nodding at me. So it would be great to hear a little bit about how the project has been for you.
Yeah, definitely. Well, when we planned this, we knew it was going to be important to sit down and understand the regional variances, understand the drivers, understand the needs, understand the challenges, recognising that every region and nation across the UK is different. It's different in terms of its industrial heritage, it's different in terms of its geographic setup, it's different in terms of its natural infrastructure, therefore, and it's different in terms of its cultural heritage as well. And all of that goes into the mix in terms of, therefore, really trying to triangulate down to what are the strengths of a region and how can they be used to help affect that net zero transition. So I guess we knew we needed to have those conversations because we knew we needed to understand those regional variances. But I think we were, even as we went around the UK, we were surprised by the breadth of opportunity, but also the difference in views around the UK's. So yeah, really, really revealing. And I think just for the listeners, I suppose, not only did we do the roundtable series where we had over 50 industry leaders, sustainability leaders, policymakers around the table, but also we undertook a survey with 100 plus respondents for the survey itself as well. So all of that has gone into the pot in terms of producing the report that's coming out the back of all of this work. But I think it's fair to say that from those conversations, it became really clear just how important, thinking about it through a place-based lens, the transition to net zero, it really is. It's the only way we're going to really unlock really tailored solutions that can tangibly make a difference and drive change, and where, importantly, local communities and local businesses can benefit from that change as well. But I think one point worth acknowledging up front was to say that actually there was a recognition in all of the regions that we are in a little bit of a winter of ESG, I think was a terminology we heard used a couple of times in terms of cost pressures, volatile energy markets, geopolitical noise out there. But I think what also came through loud and clear is that the business case remains really loud and clear for actually a net zero transition. And I think it was Manchester, actually, where one of the participants at the round table came up with a fantastic way of almost moving away from that concern around ESG as a badge to getting to actually talking about, she talked about the 4 R's and being actually, why wouldn't a business want to try and increase its revenue, try and decrease its risk, try and increase its resilience, and also improve its standing in its chosen sectors. And that for me is just good business sense, as well as absolutely supporting the transition to net zero. So a lot of rich conversations, and as I say, I'm sure we'll get into as we go through this conversation.
So loads of really interesting insights coming out there. I love the 4 R's. We'll definitely be using them again. And we've touched on it in passing about why it's so important to take a regional lens to the UK's net zero transition. So you've mentioned that everywhere has a different cultural context, natural infrastructure, man-made infrastructure, etc. But how did that come out in the conversations and in the research, Mark?
Yeah, so I think if we sort of work our way around the dial of the UK, if we take our dinner down in Bristol and down in the southwest, we heard about obviously the natural resources there and the £1 billion Bristol City Leap investment opportunity in the geothermal and offshore wind pipelines that are being built there. I was amazed to hear that there is an interconnector being connected into North Devon, which is coming in from Morocco, which is channeling solar energy being generated from Morocco into the UK. And obviously they've got Hinkley C down there in that part of the world as well. So again, playing to their natural strengths, but equally innovating. And I think what came out of that conversation was the need for finance models that normalise that sustainability into mainstream funding. Up in the Northwest, a region that set some really ambitious sort of 2030, 2038 targets for transition, there where they benefit less from natural assets, much more focused therefore on retrofit and what they can do with it, what we know are two of the biggest emitting sectors, the housing side of things, transport, so looking at zero emission buses, looking at retrofit of 10,000 plus homes, and starting to think about how they can engage large businesses with SMEs and how can they collaborate within their city regions. If we pan across to Yorkshire, and whilst we didn't have a round table there, thinking about that engagement between SMEs and large corporates, but higher education is playing quite an active part in the Yorkshire marketplace, thinking about their supply chains as well, and actually how do they make sure that in order to fund a net zero transition, they need a prosperous SME sector. So how do they make sure they're taking as much local supply from their local marketplaces, which I think is quite powerful. And then up to Scotland, which, as we all know, has an abundance of renewable technologies and sources, and a fantastic opportunity to really lead the way, I think, across the UK, given those natural assets. But what became very clear in there was actually, whilst they can generate the power, actually, can they get it into the grid? So those grid constraints came through loud and clear, and a real desire for policy clarity as well. And they started to touch on the skills there, because obviously, having had a big oil and gas industry, how do they take those skills and those workers from that industry and help them transition into the green industrial side of things? And then coming back down the East Coast into the Northeast, I think, and this is an interesting topic as we think about government connectivity as well, is we can call out our own partnership where we've partnered with the Northeast Combined Authority, with Kim McGuinness, the Metro Mayor in the Northeast, as well as the Office for Investment. And we're really looking at helping them unlock private sector funding to really help drive their thriving offshore wind and green industries. That region is benefiting from two Metro Mayors in Teesside and in the Northeast, both who've got very clear net zero plans, and that becomes very investable and very supportable. So again, I think a topic we'll probably come back to.
Great, so much to consider there. There's so many directions I could go in, but I wanted to come back to something you mentioned from Bristol, Mark, which is the need to mainstream more specific funding for the transition. And in our quantitative research, we found that almost 1 in 5 people are struggling to access private funding for their low carbon activities, and 6 in 10 say they'd like to see an easier way to access more blended finance. So what is the role of banks and the finance sector in meeting those needs across the UK?
Banks have got a really critical role to play in this, both as an enabler through provision of finance, but also as a convener. So you can sort of take it across the whole range of things, from providing capital directly to advising through our own ESG advisory team, to advising clients, to that convening element in terms of taking learnings from one sector and sharing them with another sector. We have the benefit from certainly in the corporate institutional business, I get the benefit of working with multiple different sectors and seeing how they're approaching in their own unique ways their net zero transitions, how they're talking about it around their board tables, how they're financing it, and how they're embedding it within their culture. And actually sharing that across sectors, I think, is something that all banks can do. And then importantly, and to your point, Sarah, it's how do we help innovate around the financing models? I can personally remember working on how did we fund the installation of solar panels on social housing roofs back in 2006, and we're sort of still not quite there yet in a number of different corners. So I think banks have a really important role to play with the private sector coming up with those financing models, but also with the public sector in terms of talking to the public sector and policymakers as to what do we need to be able to create a sustainable financing framework that allows us to invest in the necessary technologies to drive that net zero transition. And often, a lot of the times, and risks I've seen in the past when we've been looking at these financing models, is that certainty around policy. And without that certainty, it becomes really difficult to take a long-term view from a financing perspective. And let's be honest, a lot of the solutions for the net zero transition technologies are long-term financings. They're not short-term financing. So we need a degree of certainty on that long-term horizon. So I think it's blended finance, it's sustainable lending directly from the banks, and it's that partnerships piece, all of which are really important.
Got it. And something else that you've mentioned that I want to come back to is that it's not just the tech, it's the people. It's no good pledging to have a new factory if you haven't got the people to install it and run it. It's no good pledging to retrofit buildings or install EV chargers if you've not got the people to do that. But in our quantitative research, fewer than 1 in 10 people actually really said, great green skills are a key way for us to drive a positive impact and to enhance local sustainability collaborations, which I was shocked by, given how much I write about green skills and how much you see in the news on green skills. So what can be done to increase the focus on the people part of this, really, the jobs and the education and the skills?
I probably shared your surprise, Sarah, actually, because if I put my Yorkshire and Humber hat on for a second, when we talk there about the East Coast and the energy transition, carbon storage opportunities and what have you, particularly around the Humber region, a lot of the feedback we get there when we talk to the industrial clusters in that area is access to housing and access to skills, and actually making sure that therefore can they get the skilled workforce in the geography that they need them in to then develop the technologies to drive the transition. So yeah, I was a little surprised, but equally, if we come back to, we've already touched on so many different areas that businesses are having to think about around actually the immediacy of cost pressures, energy pressures, and what have you, and therefore actually the skills agenda does sort of sit further down that chain. But from a Lloyds perspective, we've spent quite a lot of time thinking about this. One I particularly like that's really making a big difference is our support of something called the regeneration brainery. So that's very much focused in the construction sector, and focused on creating pathways into green careers, and fostering sort of partnerships with education and industry needs. We've already sort of supported over 6,000 students since 2017, and really importantly, they've got 650 industry mentors supporting them. So we're seeing that supply of talent starting to move into those industries that really need those skills to help them play their role in the transition. We also think, and I've seen it a little bit myself, some of the technical apprenticeships still don't have the kudos that we would hope that they would have. So we've put in about 19 million into through the apprenticeship levy transfer, the support about 1,700 apprentices in 1,200 businesses. The best example of that being the Manufacturing Technology Centre in Coventry that we've supported since 2015. And the reason I mention that is because through that sponsorship, we get a really good insight as to how easy is it for the apprentices, for the graduates to get jobs, what needs to change in their curriculums to help them be more relevant for industry. So one of the things that's come out of that is whether it's further education or higher education, are there enough industrial placements within their curriculum? So i.e., are they getting enough opportunities through their learning to apply their skills, see it being put into practice, and then bring that learning back into the educational environment before they then finally move into employment? So again, that's something we've been talking about with the MTC as our leading role within the higher education space. It's also something we're talking to a number of our higher education institutions. And that would probably be my final point is I managed to get our group executive committee to host one of their meetings recently at University of Leeds. And so we had a number of their faculty leaders, Vice Chancellor, sat around the table with all of our different business leaders. First of all, we were blown away by the level of research that was going on into a number of areas that would help support the transition to net zero. And that won't be unique to University of Leeds. Okay, that will be, we know the solution is out there in all of our higher education and further education institutions around the UK in terms of how do we speed this up. But what became really apparent was that there was fantastic research, but the researchers didn't know how to access business, and business did not know this great research was going on. So again, back to that skills that you can almost, therefore, when you come back to your statistic that you quoted at the start of this segment, you can understand why, because it's not on the business radar, because we're not sort of connecting business with the educational and skills system. So again, coming back to your role of what can banks do, I think again that's another convening role we can play in trying to link our higher education clients to our businesses.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we've talked about there this need for a whole ecosystem approach. It sounds like there are pockets of great people with great ideas doing great things and just joining them up. And something that you've said that they all need, regardless of where they're working, is the right signals from government. So both a long-term and a stable vision and the right interventions at the right time where there's an immediate need. And that was really identified in our poll. So given that, where are there opportunities for greater collaboration, not only between the private sector and education and finance, but also involving policy in this as well?
Yeah, well, I touched on earlier, I think that certainty around policy and hopefully that cross-party nature of certainty around policy is almost one of the biggest unlocks, I think, within all of this. It was really interesting as you went around the UK and that whole conversation about devolution. So the two mayoral combined authorities up in the northeast of England, so in Teesside and in the northeast. And that's really helped, that those authorities with clear strategies is really helping them unlock their potential around that net zero transition. So that was hugely seen as a positive up there. You go to Manchester and in the northwest, you've got two, again, very well established mayoral authorities in Liverpool and in Manchester. But interestingly, that the conversation around the table in Bristol was actually, is devolution getting in the way? Is it slowing us down? And is it disconnecting central government too much from actually understanding what's important to a region? So it was interesting seeing those different views. But I think it's going to be really important. You've already heard me touch on the National Wealth Fund, and I think the creation of that National Wealth Fund has been hugely welcomed because that does help unlock a number of opportunities through that blended finance approach. I do think through such as the report we're producing here and the conversations we've had with edie, as well as areas such as the CBI, we've all got a role to play in terms of that advocacy and engagement with government and representing the sectors that we all talk to make sure their voices are heard loud and clear. And as I say, that's at local government level as well as central government level. So I think obviously government have come up with their industrial strategy. We've been working with the CBI on sort of taking an industrial strategy around the UK where we're taking different industrial clusters of each of the 8 elements of the industrial strategy and hosting events in different parts of the UK, looking at really how is that going to actually come to life. A key area within that is clean energy. And again, coming out of those conversations is that real importance of having a 10-year strategy that people can then get behind and invest in. And I suppose most recently, we saw government host the Regional Investment Summit up in Birmingham. And again, in there, we heard Mr. Miliband talk about the key foundations necessary to delivering government's clean energy mission. And that was certainty, so clarity via the Clean Power Act in 2030, the breaking down barriers, an example of this being the planning reform that we keep hearing about and talking about, crowding in more private investment. So how do we give those overseas investors the confidence that actually, why wouldn't you invest in some of these mayoral combined authority areas who've got real clear plans and are leading on energy transition? And we've got to stay the course. I think sometimes we're quite hard on UK and where UK is, but I do think when we look around the world, we are one of those leaders. And I think it's fair to say, I think Miliband quoted that we're knee deep into the transition already, and we've got to keep going and getting deeper into it. I think the natural competitive nature, the engineering background, the education background, the natural resources we've got, the ingenuity in the UK, we have a real opportunity to really continue to lead in this area.
I like the knee-deep analogy. I feel like maybe back in 2020 when everyone was just first making a declaration, maybe that was just dipping the toe in.
Yeah.
And now we're into the real practicalities of this mark. So at that important juncture, what is the next step for government? You've mentioned some of the good things that are already going on, but clearly in our survey, people would like to see a little bit more in certain areas.
you're right, it came out. Certainly, there was a real desire for a clear national framework that empowers local delivery. So I think 64% of our responders cited they wanting to have more power to drive net zero on a local basis. And 87% of our responders said that success needed joint action across central government, local government, and business. So I think it's reflecting our conversation today. And again, our responders were talking about needing that stable long-term policy horizons beyond 2030. And that's what will really unlock that private investment. And especially, and we've been in rooms with government where we know this has been debated, especially the need for grid upgrades to get this energy into the grid, get those renewable connections and consenting reform resolved. I think other things we could be thinking about is prioritising home networks. Top asks, again, from our responders was around funding for climate-ready homes and retrofit. And again, we've touched on some of that today, but I think there's more we could do. And upgrading those local energy networks. So again, can a local area generate their own local power to fund local businesses and local communities? And then making funding routes simpler, more standardised grants, make it easier to access those grants, particularly for smaller renewable projects with a clearer route to market. And then lastly, I think there is that element that continues to build around enabling a just transition and therefore policies that balance biodiversity, community consent and speed. So investable projects that move at pace whilst driving that local value, and they're not seeing the value sucked out of their local region and benefiting somewhere else.
And I think all of those elements are super important, super interesting. We could record a separate podcast on any of them really, Mark, but for today we are almost out of time. So before we finish, it would be great to just hear a little bit more about how people can learn more about all the great work we've been talking about, the findings we've been alluding to, and how they can get involved going forward.
Yeah. So look, place-based net zero is definitely how we turn ambition into investable projects. And banks are here to finance, convene and de-risk that journey for our regions, as we've touched on. And that's from buildings and local power to skills and to SMEs. And we know what works. It's clarity, it's collaboration, and it's capital. And I think we've touched on all of those today. And we're really here to help deliver that. Collectively, the regions could take a leadership role in green growth. And I think it's a really unique opportunity for the regions to grab that and run with it. And look, if our listeners would like to find out more about the industry leading white paper, then it's onto Edie's website to download it. There's some great insights. There's some practical guidance. What I really like about it, it's not just playing back what we've heard. It's also coming back with ideas and concepts and things to really challenge businesses on and local government on to think about. And if you'd like a Lloyds relationship manager to contact you to help with your regional growth and investment needs, then please DM me via my LinkedIn and I'll make sure we connect you to the right person.
Great, thanks Mark. And as Mark said, all of the report, all of the write-ups are on our website, which is edie.net. But for this episode of Edie Extra, that really is all the time we have. So Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for giving me the time, Sarah.